Termo to Madeline, audio edition, page 254, chapter titled Finlanders. Now the fascinating thing about the Finnish settlers is that they all came to the plains and settled between 9 Mile Point and Dry Valley Gap, not having known each other previously. Now a couple of them homesteaded, but the others bought relinquishments of previously filed properties or private property. All the Finnish people milked a few cows and shipped cream to Reno on the NCO, as did many of their neighbors. Carl Miller was a Finlander. He had a wife and they had 2 children, Dagmar and Carl. They lived out in the flat away from the hills. There were 3 families and 1 young bachelor who lived up in a cove on the west side of 9 Mile Point. Now Paul Karki was the bachelor. That was really not his Finnish name, but it had been proven too difficult for Americans and had changed it to Karki from Karkianen. Equally difficult for people on the Madeline Plains was the name Halpanen. Matt and Lempi Halpanen had their son Eugene. They lived in the homestead in that little Finnish settlement. They never changed their names for the benefit of the locals and were generally referred to as the Alpine family. Also living in that area was the Lasko family. There was Gusti and Edla and their daughter Vieno and their 3 sons, Sulo, Ani, and Vieno. The second son, Ani, was the only native Finlander. He was born in the old country while the family was back there on a visit. The other 3 children were born in Massachusetts. Gusti was a stonemason and had come to Placer County, California, following his trade. Now in 1916 he moved his family to the homestead there out of Termo. They spent the first several years there grubbing brush and scratching out a living as best they could. Eventually the old folks left, moved back to Sacramento Valley. Some of the children stayed for a few years, Ani and especially Sulo sticking it out the longest. Sulo finally ended up with all the property, running a small dairy of 15 cows there for several years. At the time of this writing, Sulo is still at Termo, owning and operating the Termo store. Ben and Hannan Sakari and their children were the other Finnish family in that area. They had 1 daughter, Irene, when they moved to the plains. Later, while living on the Madeline Plains, 2 sons, Arvid and Carl, and 2 daughters, Dora and Dorothy, were born. Mary Metcalf and her daughter Alice delivered the little twins. They only weighed 4 and 5 pounds, and Mrs. Metcalf wrapped each one of them in a little blanket. Then each little girl was placed in a shoebox in the warming oven of the Sakari's kitchen stove to keep them warm. The Sakaris were the last of the Finlanders to come to Termo, arriving in 1916. Benjamin Sakari farmed a homestead that he had bought and milked a few cows. He also trapped bobcats and coyotes in the winter for their pelts. Mrs. Sakari's father, a widower, was also a Finlander who came to the plains at the same time as the Sakaris. His name was Michael Oist, and he was the one who first interested the Sakaris in farming in the area. He had been living in Rockland, California, and had written to them at their home in Butte, Montana, to tell them about the farms and homesteads on the Madeline Plains. They all came together in 1916, but Mr. Oist died of miner's disease in 1918. He had worked for many years in the gold mines at Goldfield, Nevada, and in the silver mines in Tonopah. Mrs. Sakari's brother John Oist lived around the area a lot also, but he did not take up any land. Mostly he buckarooed for George Williams at Madeline. Next chapter, titled Settlers at Bailey Creek. Now where Brockman ended and the Bailey Creek area started is impossible to determine, but there were several settlers in the Bailey Creek Dry Valley Gap corner of the plains. The Metcalf boys have already been mentioned, so we will start with Stephen and Lily Ansel and their 2 children, Stephen and Florence. Now they came from San Francisco, where Mr. Ansel had been a policeman. Their homestead bordered the Sakari property, Bill Moody, a Civil War veteran, came to Dry Valley Gap from Massachusetts in 1889 and took up a homestead just across the gap on the Madeline Plains side. Now, he and his wife and their son, Will, lived in Dry Valley for many years. It was while they lived there that Mr. Moody died. Mr. Moody continued to live there until 1918. When the younger Moody married a third Whittinger daughter, Winnie, they set up housekeeping on the homestead on the plains side of the gap and took up more land to go along with it. The Moodys farmed and milked some cows and raised a few hogs. In fact, the locals referred to the older Moody, who was retired by the time of the homestead boom, as Pig Moody, because of all the hogs he had raised over the years. There were a few other settlers in the general Bailey Creek area besides the Swains, who also predated the homestead era. Gus and Rachel McCurry lived there and in Grasshopper Valley at various times with their family. Gus generally worked around for the various cattle ranchers and also at the Bailey Creek sawmill when it was going strong. Ollie and Angie Simpson and their daughter lived out in the flat below Bailey Creek, as did Raymond Rooney. Next chapter, titled Termo Settlers. Again, drawing a line between Termo and Bailey Creek or Termo and Ravendale is difficult and possibly pointless. They are all part of the Madeline Plains, and there was always a certain amount of overlapping. But some people sent their children to school at Termo, while others sent theirs to Dry Valley School on the plains side of the gap, or the McDonald Peak School west of the Brockman Ranch, or to Ravendale. Some people picked up their mail at Termo, while others went to Brockman or Ravendale. Voters who lived at Termo either voted at Dry Valley or Ravendale. So we will look at Termo settlers as those who sent their children to school there and picked up their mail there. Now, starting on the Bailey Creek side of Termo, there was an old German immigrant named William Kemper, who had a homestead for several years. He sold out to Jake and Thelma Beets. They had 2 children, Flora and Edna. Another German family that settled west of Termo were the Gutmans. They took up the original homestead at the Mud Springs. George and Katerina had 6 children, most of whom were grown. There were George, Conrad, Fred, Louis, Kate, and Lena. They were not there too many years before everyone but Conrad and Fred left the country. They stayed another year or so and sold the place to a French family by the name of Raynal in 1914. Now, the Raynals were there for a year when Pierre Ducasse, another Frenchman, came on the scene. He came up from San Francisco on a vacation with his wife, Jean, and their 3 children, Arthur, Irene, and Roger. Now, while at Termo, he loaned Mr. Raynal some money. As time progressed, it became evident that in order to get his money back, he would just have to buy the place. So it was that the Ducasses ended up with Mud Springs. Pierre was a semi-retired San Francisco contractor and builder who made a killing in his trade after the San Francisco earthquake. He was originally from Pau, France, and his wife first came from Lourdes, France. On the plains, they continued to add to their holdings until they owned over 5,000 acres, spread out from Chase Canyon to the Ravendale Cemetery. 3 other families came to the area between Mud Springs and Termo. They too came from San Francisco, and they all came together. These families were Tom and Rose Wood and sons, Tommy and Lawrence, John and Annie Doone, their 2 sons Melvin and Eddie, and daughter Rose named after Rose Wood, and Mark and Adele Eds and their sons Leo. They, too, had all been through the San Francisco earthquake. Tom Wood was a carpenter and had found himself swamped with work for several years afterwards. Now, in the spring of 1914, Tom Wood, John Doone, and Mark Eds bought a team and wagon and traveled all the way from San Francisco to Termo. When they had filed on a homestead and gotten their cabins built and ready, they sent for their families. The women and children rode the train to Reno and then boarded the narrow-gauge NCO and traveled to Termo to be reunited with the menfolk. Like most, all the homesteaders, they cleared their land and planted rye, and then sat back and watched the rabbits clean it off as soon as it came up. On the other side of Termo, east toward Kilby Cove, were a few settlers too. James Kilby, of course, was one of the first. He had a cabin at the base of Mount McDonald, 2.5 miles northwest of Termo. The Schaffs had a place out in the flat closer to Termo. There were Sherman Schoff and his wife Iva and Sherman's brother, John and his wife Jenny. John and Jenny had 2 small children, but he died, and Jenny and the 2 children moved to Susanville in 1918. It was at that time that the Brysons came to Termo from Sears, California. Hugh Bryson had met Jim Coe of Ravendale and Sears. Coe had a homestead, right, that he wanted to sell. Hugh bought it and moved his wife Mary Ann and their children Bethel, Ernest, Ida, and Delma up to the site. Later the Brysons' oldest daughter Ella and her husband John Wilkie and their little children also came to the plains. They filed on a place just across Juniper Ridge on the Red Rock side. They soon became disillusioned with the Madeline Plains and moved back to Sears in a couple of years. Bethel Bryson went with them, but the rest of the family stayed on. Mrs. Bryson was not in good health. So in the winter of 1919-1920, the family went back to Sears for the winter. Now Mary Ann died that winter, but Hugh and the younger children continued to come back to the homestead for many years in the summertime. The arrival of the Coffin family in Termo came in 1911, 6 years before the Bryson family. Earl and Frankie Coffin both filed on homesteads at the base of Mount McDonald in Kilby Cove. They had 2 small children, Mildred and Lester, at that time. Gladys and Chubb would be born later. Earl's father, Harvey R.T. Collins, also came to Termo with his wife, Arietta, and filed on a homestead. As time passed, Earl Coffin bought out most of the homesteaders in the area. With these homesteads and the land the Coffins had taken up, as well as a school section that they had bought, they eventually had over 3,000 acres on which they ran a lot of horses and mules. First, Earl bought James Kilby's place. Kilby, in his 1-room house, they sat down on low ground, so the Coffins moved it up to the hillside and added a couple of rooms to it for their own home. The Coffins also bought out the Schoffs, and the Sherman Schoff went to work for them, a job that was to last over the next 36 years. After a few years, the Coffins quit raising mules and just raised horses and a few cattle. They also had a place at Standish where they wintered their livestock. All right, next is a side note from the author. He writes, "The foregoing might be somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 cents of the homesteaders who came and went. Due to the lack of space and the utter impossibility of tracing every one of them that came and left, it will have to suffice for all." End. All right, next chapter, titled The Rebirth of Termo. From the time the town of Madeline entered the scene, Termo began to regress until it had but disappeared. At the time the NCO terminus was moved to the town of Madeline, the quickly constructed houses, shacks, barns, corrals, and the hotel that constituted Termo were torn down and removed by those who owned them. In a matter of 10 years, everything but the warehouse, 1 small livery barn, and the railroad agent's house were gone, and the town was deserted. A literal ghost town. Even the agent's house was unoccupied because it was easier for him to live at the hotel at Madeline and ride back and forth on the train each day to take care of what shipping or passengers' business there was in Termo. Then, by a strange quirk, the first resident in 10 years moved into Termo. Joe Brown happened to be a hobo traveling north on the NCO boxcar in 1912. The conductor of the train either must have hated vagrants or else he knew Joe Brown and had something against him personally. Otherwise, why would he have kicked him off the train at such a place as Termo when he discovered him in the boxcar? Joe looked the situation over as the train pulled away, leaving him alone on the cold, wind-swept desert, and decided that the uninhabited NCO's agent's house, built out of ties and corrugated iron, was the best place to get out of the weather. Now he moved in, chased the wood rats out, and stayed there the rest of his life. Joe was an old man at the time, but he would be there another 10 years or so. Indeed, he was soon the NCO agent taking care of all railroad business at Termo. Either the NCO had decided they could not defeat him, so they joined him, or else they just had a hard time finding anyone willing to live in Termo, or anywhere close, so they gave him the job, the latter explanation being the most probable. For the next couple of years, Joe was the only resident in the town of Termo, with the exception of a half a dozen dogs and cats that he kept. Then another couple of characters came on the scene, the characters every bit as unique as Joe Brown. They were from the town of Murphys in Calaveras County, California. Why or how they showed up at Termo is a baffling question. George Green was a storyteller, excelled by no one. His wife Elizabeth was a spiritualist and self-proclaimed medical doctor, always signing her name Dr. Elizabeth M. Green. Mrs. Green's spiritualism made a few people around Termo nervous, especially Mrs. Bryson, who was a devoutly religious person. One such unnerving experience came one night, several years after they first came to Termo, when Mrs. Green woke her husband up in the middle of the night and told him old Joe Brown had just gone by the corner of their housetop on his way to another world, calling good-bye to them as he sailed along. The next morning Mr. Green went over to Joe's cabin and found him dead. His dogs were dutifully protecting his body, while cats were milling around all over the room. Elizabeth's escapades were only outmatched by some of George's stories. George and a man by the name of Jim Brewer, who would become a partner in the Termo store and garage, had both been prospectors in the Klondike County of Alaska during the big gold rush. Some of George's oddities often took on the characteristics of Death Valley Scotty. Every once in a while he would disappear and be gone for several days or even a couple of weeks. Even his wife, with her supposed psychic powers, would not know where he had gone. Then he would come home one day with a sack containing a few gold nuggets and some ore samples. The stories that went along with the quartz were always a wild, hair-raising adventure in prospecting at some lost mine in the mountains near Termo. It really is a wonder that the little bunch of gold did not wear completely away, considering what he had to go through each time to find it. Anyway, children loved to hear him tell tall tales. He loved little children, too. A child never came into his store in Termo that he did not have a sack of candy for the little one to take home. Children always left Termo, sucking on a piece of hard candy and shaking their heads in amazement at the wonderful adventures that Mr. Green had been through. George and Elizabeth Green, in spite of their oddities, were superb merchants. They built the first general store in Termo and operated it long after the homestead boom had ceased. In the latter part of the homestead era, they and Jim Brewer built a garage in Termo. Eventually, they were to go back to Calaveras County, leaving Jim Brewer to operate the garage and Tom Wood to care for the store. The Greens owned and operated the town of Termo for almost 10 years before selling it to Jim Brewer, who sold it to Tom Wood a couple of years later. Next chapter, titled The Changing Town of Madeline, page 262.